This is also a moment of profound change for the royal family. 5 minutes ago, the silence that had surrounded Britain's throne was broken. Princess Anne stood alongside Prince William and confirmed what Buckingham Palace had been reluctant to say out loud. King Charles had officially withdrawn from active sovereign duty. Then came the second announcement. William's coronation had already been scheduled. The date had been set. Westminster Abbey had been informed, and the machinery of royal succession was already in motion. This was no longer preparation for a distant future. The future had come early. Before we go further into what this truly means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update as this story develops. Anne held the room with composure, but the strain beneath her words was impossible to conceal. William stood beside her without Charles or Camilla, and their absence carried its own message. This was not a routine family briefing. It was a constitutional handover, the formal transfer of royal authority from one sovereign to the next. Everyone in that room understood that history was shifting beneath their feet. The princess spoke first. In a recorded palace address released shortly afterward, she confirmed that Charles had formally stepped back from active sovereign responsibilities. She then named the date that would define the monarchy going forward, Saturday, the 17th of October, 2026. On that day, William would be crowned at Westminster Abbey, the historic church where British coronations have taken place for centuries. The order had been signed. The decision was final. There would be no reversal of what had already been set in motion. William drew a slow breath before he spoke. The prince did not smile, and he chose no language of triumph. He said the crown had come through his father's sacrifice, and that no ceremony could remove the pain carried inside that truth. His voice held steady, but grief pressed against every word. The future king had spent decades preparing for duty. He had never prepared to receive it through his father's withdrawal. Anne answered that grief with discipline. She praised her brother's decades of service, yet her voice tightened when she described the weight he had carried. The princess loved Charles as a brother, but she now had to guide his son toward the role Charles could no longer fulfill. Loyalty pulled her backward. Duty forced her forward. The deepest revelation came shortly after. Coronation preparations had not begun that same morning. Senior officials, including the Archbishop of Canterbury and the administration of Westminster Abbey, had received a sealed transition order weeks earlier. Someone inside the royal circle had ensured the date could not be challenged, postponed, or reversed. Then the briefing ended. William turned toward an empty chair that had been reserved for Charles. The king had intended to be present, but something behind palace doors had stopped him from walking through them, and that hidden moment was about to expose the private fear beneath the public decision. Behind the official language were four people facing four entirely different losses. Charles was surrendering the authority he had waited a lifetime to inherit. William was accepting a crown sooner than he had emotionally prepared for. Anne was becoming the steady hand between two generations of kings. And Catherine was watching her husband move toward a destiny that would change every dimension of their family life. The announcement belonged to the institution, but the pain behind it was entirely human. Earlier that morning, Charles had sat alone with the final transition statement resting on the desk before him. The king read through every line slowly, including the sentence that confirmed the end of his active sovereign duties. Sovereign duties are the official responsibilities carried out by the monarch on behalf of the country. When he reached the line requiring his signature, he turned the page face down and said nothing. That silence revealed what no public statement ever could. He understood precisely what he was giving away. William carried a different burden. The prince had devoted his adult life to preparing for the crown. Yet training for succession had always allowed him to believe his father would remain between him and that crown for years to come. Now that protection was gone, Duty was no longer approaching from a distance. It had arrived at his door. Catherine found him adjusting the same cuff over and over before the briefing began. She placed her hand over his and quietly stopped the movement. She told him he did not have to pretend the moment felt like a victory. William looked at her and admitted what he had not said to Anne or to Charles. He was frightened. Catherine did not offer hollow reassurance. She simply reminded him that fear did not make him weak. It meant he fully understood what the crown would cost. Camilla felt that cost in a different way. The queen consort had imagined completing Charles's reign beside him, sharing the pressure, the public criticism, and the final years of service. His withdrawal changed more than his title. It threatened her influence, her public place, and the future she had believed they were building together. She did not challenge him that morning, but the distance between them had already begun to open. Anne understood every fracture. The princess had not merely supported the transition, she had directed it, following a documented private conversation with her brother, in which Charles had asked her to prevent William from refusing the crown out of guilt or delaying the coronation to spare him pain. Catherine then learned why October had specifically been chosen. Charles feared that waiting would create rival factions, competing loyalties, and genuine confusion over who held real authority. He wanted the transfer completed before uncertainty could harden into crisis, but the pain had begun earlier than any of them had publicly acknowledged. During a private ceremony at Windsor, Charles had suffered a moment of hesitation so serious that Anne later described it in a recorded family account as the instant everything truly changed. That hidden moment was the real beginning of the end. Every historic decision has one moment that cannot be undone. For Charles, it arrived inside Windsor Castle during a private investiture attended by only a small number of relatives and senior aides. The ceremony had begun normally. Then the king stopped speaking, lowered the insignia in his hand, and looked toward William as though the room had become suddenly unfamiliar. What followed lasted fewer than 3 minutes. But those 3 minutes forced the family to confront a truth they had been carefully avoiding. 3 weeks before the public announcement, Charles had agreed to lead the private ceremony because the palace needed a visible sign of stability. An investiture is a formal occasion in which the monarch presents honors to individuals being recognized for their service. William, Anne, Catherine, and Camilla attended because the recipients had long-standing connections to the royal household. The gathering was small, but the stakes were significant. After months of reduced public appearances, the family needed evidence that the king could still carry the crown's most demanding responsibilities. Charles began with confidence. He greeted the first recipient, lifted the insignia, and delivered the opening words without hesitation. Then everything shifted. He lost his place in the central declaration, repeated the opening line, and fell silent. The king remained still, the honor still held in his hand. William watched his father's expression tighten. Catherine stopped breathing for a moment. Camilla shifted toward her husband and did not move again. William waited for Charles to continue. He believed that stepping in would expose his father's difficulty in front of witnesses and transform one painful pause into a public humiliation. Then the king looked directly at him and whispered, "You must finish this." William refused at first. Charles repeated the instruction, this time with a sharpness that cut through the shame of the moment. The future king understood that refusing was no longer an act of protection. It was making everything worse. Camilla moved toward Charles, but Anne raised one hand and stopped her. The queen consort read cruelty into that gesture, while the princess understood it as mercy. Comforting Charles before the room had cleared would make him feel watched, pitied, and diminished in front of people who were there to receive an honor from him. Catherine quietly redirected the witnesses' attention toward William as he completed the declaration and presented the honor his father could no longer deliver. The door closed after the ceremony, but the crisis did not close with it. Charles summoned Anne alone and spoke through what would become a documented private account later placed in the family archive. The king admitted the difficulty had not been simple exhaustion. He no longer trusted himself to guarantee the steadiness a sovereign was required to provide. Anne listened without interrupting. Charles then asked his sister to manage the transition, but he set one condition. William had to hear the decision from him personally. No official advisor or formal document would speak in his place. The legal arrangements could wait. Before any date, any signature, or any proclamation, Charles needed to look his eldest son in the eyes and tell him that the throne now belonged to him. No advisors stood between them. No cameras preserved the moment. There was only a father, a son, and the crown that had shaped the course of both their lives. Charles had rehearsed what he intended to say, yet when William walked into the room, the prepared words remained untouched on the desk. Instead, the king pushed back his chair, looked at the man who would replace him, and said something that broke through the final barrier between private fear and public history. Charles had chosen a small sitting room at Clarence's house because he wanted no officials present to shape the exchange. Clarence House is the London residence most closely associated with the king's private working life, far removed from the ceremonial weight of Buckingham Palace. Anne waited elsewhere in the building but did not enter. The princess understood this conversation had to belong entirely to a father and his son. Charles spoke first. He told William that the Windsor incident had confirmed a fear he had been carrying alone for months. If he continued to rule while doubting his own steadiness, one public failure could damage the monarchy more deeply than stepping aside ever would. He had devoted a lifetime to defending the institution. He would not allow pride to become the force that weakened it. "I cannot carry it further," he said. William did not respond with sympathy. The prince reacted with anger, asking how his father could reach such a decision without acknowledging what immediate kingship would demand from Catherine, George, Charlotte, and Louis. He had prepared for the crown, but not for losing the time with his family that he had always fought to protect. Charles listened. The accusation struck hard. William then asked the question that shifted the tone entirely. Had the king truly made this choice himself, or had advisors persuaded him that he had become a burden? Charles rose from his chair. The monarch insisted the decision was entirely his own. No courtier had pressured him. No physician had ordered him. No faction had removed him. He was surrendering power because holding on to it had become the greater danger. The silence deepened. Charles slid a transition paper across the desk. A transition paper is the formal written document that transfers active royal authority and sets the next phase of succession in motion. William refused to touch it. Charles then removed his signet ring and placed it beside the document. The ring bore his personal royal mark, a symbol of authority and approval. He told his son he would not force him to feel ready, but he would require him to act with responsibility. Then came the final disclosure. October the 17th had been chosen by Charles himself, and the coronation framework had already been formally approved. The king wanted order rather than the image of a weakened monarch clinging to authority. William finally picked up the document, but he would not sign until he understood who had controlled the process and who had attempted to exploit it. When the royal family reached its most fragile point, authority did not rest with the loudest voice in the palace. It rested with Princess Anne. Charles trusted her because she had no desire for the throne or its attention. William relied on her because she would tell him the truth, even when it caused pain. Yet Anne's control of the transition created enemies inside the household, particularly among those who feared a new king would end their influence before the coronation bells had rung. Anne moved between private meetings, legal briefings, and coronation planning sessions without allowing emotion to slow the process. She became the central connection between Charles, William, senior courtiers, constitutional advisors, and Westminster officials. Constitutional advisors are the experts who guide the monarchy through lawful transfers of power. Her role was not ceremonial. She determined the order in which authority would pass, ensuring no office could delay the transfer or manufacture confusion between the outgoing king and the future monarch. Charles reinforced that authority in writing. The king gave his sister formal power to keep October the 17th fixed, restrict knowledge of the plan, and block private interference before William signed. Anne understood the necessity. A single careless leak or competing instruction could create two centers of loyalty inside the palace and fracture the household before the transition was complete. Camilla confronted her before the next briefing. The queen consort demanded to know why she had been excluded from the earliest discussions. Anne answered without raising her voice. This was a matter of sovereign authority, she said, not personal rank. Camilla heard judgment in those words. She accused the princess of treating her as an outsider after everything she had built alongside Charles. Anne did not apologize, and Camilla walked away furious. William challenged her next. The prince resented the cold efficiency of the transition and warned that stripping all feeling from the process would deepen the family's pain. Anne reminded him that accepting the crown could not be managed like a private disagreement. William replied that removing all humanity from the decision would make him the kind of monarch he had never intended to become. Later, Anne sat alone with Charles and asked the question no one else had dared to raise. Did he regret choosing October? The king admitted the date felt brutally close, yet delaying it would leave William suspended between prince and sovereign, carrying responsibility without clear authority. That ambiguity was the one outcome Charles would not allow, and then uncovered the hidden proposal. A faction within the senior household wanted Charles to retain nominal authority while William performed most of the actual duties. Nominal authority means holding a title while someone else carries the real responsibilities of the position. She rejected it without hesitation. Two centers of power would inevitably turn father and son into rivals, and that was precisely what Charles had asked her to prevent. William eventually signed the acceptance papers. Within hours, fragments of the transition began leaking from the faction that had been overruled. The coronation date was now spreading beyond palace walls before Charles could deliver his final address, and the first fractures were already reaching the public. The moment William signed, the palace changed. Offices that had served Charles began receiving new instructions. Courtiers who had waited for the king's approval were redirected toward the future monarch. Invitations were revised. Official seals were replaced. Even the language used in private briefings shifted register. For some, it felt like an orderly and necessary transition. For others, it felt like a door closing without warning. And behind one of those doors, Camilla was beginning to understand what Charles's decision truly meant for her own place within the institution. William signed the formal acceptance papers, with Anne standing beside him. The prince used Charles's pen, and that small choice carried more weight than any prepared speech could have. Formal acceptance papers are the documents confirming that the heir will take full sovereign responsibility and proceed toward coronation. Anne watched his hand pause before the final stroke. She understood he was not simply accepting power. He was accepting the end of his father's active reign. The change moved immediately. Palace departments transferred daily briefings, government communications, ceremonial approvals, and state decisions to William. The future king was now receiving papers that had belonged exclusively to Charles only hours before. That speed mattered because uncertainty at the top could divide the household, confuse ministers, and quietly erode public trust. Every new instruction made the transfer clearer. Every cleared desk made it more painful. Camilla discovered the shape of her loss through a revised official schedule. The queen consort read the page twice, removed her glasses, and asked why several state occasions no longer listed her beside Charles. She had expected his withdrawal to reduce their shared workload, not to dismantle the public partnership they had spent years building. The printed timetable made the truth feel cold and irreversible. Charles attempted to explain. He told her William needed complete authority, free from competing signals or divided loyalties. Camilla answered that he had protected the crown while leaving her to discover the personal costs through an administrative page. She accused him of deciding their future alone. He did not deny it, and that silence wounded her more deeply than any argument could have. Then the crisis expanded beyond the family. A broadcaster received a confidential version of the October 17th coronation date before the official statement had been released, prompting an immediate internal inquiry, a formal investigation into who had accessed and shared the restricted information. Anne suspected the leak had not been accidental. It was designed to make the transition appear unstable and open to challenge. William quickly identified the source. The information had moved through an office connected to officials who opposed Anne's clean transfer of authority and wanted Charles to retain a portion of his former role. Their objective was delay, external pressure, and institutional confusion. William refused to postpone any part of the plan. Before facing the public, however, the prince went to Charles one final time. On this occasion, he was not an heir seeking permission. He was the next king seeking peace before the crown separated them permanently. There were no constitutional documents on the table. No advisors waited outside with prepared instructions. Charles and William sat facing one another as father and son, stripped of the formal language that had previously protected them from the most difficult truths. One had spent a lifetime waiting to become king. The other had spent a lifetime knowing he would eventually take his place. Now that moment had come, and neither man wanted their final private exchange to be defined by unresolved anger. William arrived late in the evening, after the coronation date had already spread beyond palace control. He asked for the room to be cleared, leaving no secretary, courtier, or official standing between them. Every earlier conversation had been shaped by duty. This one had to be shaped entirely by honesty. Charles spoke first. The king admitted that losing the crown was not his deepest fear. What truly frightened him was the possibility that his son might inherit it carrying resentment. He had never wanted William to believe that stepping down was an act of abandonment or a final burden transferred onto his shoulders. William answered without the anger that had marked their earlier exchange. He admitted that fear had been hiding beneath every accusation he had made. The future king was worried about Catherine's well-being, the pressure already surrounding George, Charlotte, and Louis, and the possibility that kingship would pull him away from the family life he had fought hard to protect. He had witnessed what duty could consume. He did not want his own children to experience that same distance. Charles lowered his voice. The monarch acknowledged that the crown had taken time away from his sons, and that duty had too often become an excuse for emotional silence. He told William not to repeat that pattern. A sovereign could serve the country without becoming unreachable to the people closest to him. Then Charles opened his hand. The signet ring rested in his palm, the same ring he had placed beside the transition papers. A signet ring carries a personal royal mark and represents the authority of the person who wears it. The king did not ask his son to put it on. Instead, he closed William's fingers around it and told him to carry power without allowing power to harden him. William gave his father the reassurance Charles had been waiting to hear. The prince said the new reign would not erase him or diminish his place within the family. He would attend the coronation with dignity, not as a defeated king, but as the man who had chosen stability over pride. The anger finally released its grip. Charles gave his blessing, and William accepted it without any trace of triumph. The following morning, Anne stood beside the prince before they entered the briefing room together. This time, William did not hesitate. He carried the confirmed date, his father's ring, and the quiet peace they had found in private. Now the country would be asked to decide what that sacrifice truly meant. Within minutes, the announcement crossed every border and interrupted every broadcast. The words, "Charles steps down," appeared beneath images of William and Anne standing side by side. Some viewers saw sacrifice. Others saw the abrupt end of an era they had believed would last considerably longer. Outside the palace gates, people began gathering before officials had even installed barriers. Anne's recorded address played repeatedly across major networks. The princess confirmed that Charles had stepped back and that William would be crowned on October the 17th. A coronation is the formal ceremony in which a new monarch is publicly crowned and dedicated to the service of the nation. The date immediately became the center of every conversation because it demonstrated that the transition was not distant or uncertain. It was already in motion. The palace released a written statement praising Charles's decades of service and presenting the change as planned, lawful, and unified. The king had personally approved the transfer, and that detail carried significant weight. Without his clear endorsement, the public might have read William's rise as a family conflict. With it, the moment became an act of deliberate sacrifice. The country divided emotionally, as it often does at these moments. Some mourned Charles and felt he had yielded too soon. Others respected the monarch precisely for placing long-term stability above personal pride. William absorbed the hope that came with the transition, but also the weight of comparison before his reign had even formally begun. Camilla's absence from the announcement generated a separate wave of commentary. The queen consort had stood beside Charles through years of scrutiny and public pressure, yet she was not present at the moment his reign effectively ended. Observers questioned whether her role had been quietly reduced. Later, Catherine appeared alongside William, and the princess provided a quiet steadiness that reassured many who had watched the day unfold with uncertainty. Her presence also sharpened the contrast between the household that was ending and the one now taking shape. Then one moment cut through all the noise. Outside Buckingham Palace, a young boy pressed two handwritten cards against the iron railings. One read, "Thank you, King Charles." The other said, "Be brave, King William." Cameras captured the two cards touching at their edges, and the crowd around them fell briefly silent. Gratitude and uncertainty had found the same small space along the same stretch of fence. A national newspaper offered the final image of the day. Its front page showed Charles leaving through a private door, while William entered another beneath the single headline, "The Crown Passes." The words transformed a constitutional procedure into a human story of departure and duty arriving simultaneously. As uncertainty gradually gave way to acceptance, attention shifted toward Westminster Abbey. The question was no longer whether William would become king. It was what his father's final act had taught him about the true weight of wearing the crown. In the end, this was not the story of a king being removed or a son claiming power before his time. It was the story of a father recognizing the precise moment when holding on would damage everything he loved most. Charles stepped down because he understood that the crown belongs to something larger than any individual ambition. William accepted because refusing